Elizabeth Whitmore reached across the table, took the pen out of her husband's hand, and signed the deed herself. The room went dead quiet. She blotted the ink, set the pen down, and slid the paper toward the woman who'd been given her home. "There," she said. "Now it's done proper." Nathaniel Whitmore had come home that summer to give his mistress the main house and his wife a rotting cottage on the edge of nothing. He never once asked why his wife was smiling. If you're with me, subscribe to the channel and stay to the end and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Virginia, July 1816. The heat had settled over Whitmore Hall like a hand pressed down on it, and the flies had got into the front room, and nobody had thought to open the far windows because nobody in that house did anything anymore that wasn't ordered. Elizabeth Whitmore stood at the head of the long table with ink on her thumb. Nathaniel Whitmore did not move. He was 34 years old, the richest landholder between the Ravenna and the county line, and he had come home from 4 months on the road with a plan folded in his coat pocket, and the plan had not included his wife taking the pen out of his hand. "Elizabeth," he said. "Nathaniel, that was not yours to sign." "No," she agreed. "It was yours. But you were sitting there turning that pen over and over like a man deciding whether to shoot a dog he raised. I've been standing here 20 minutes. I got tired." Caroline Bellamy laughed. It was a small, pretty well-practiced sound, and she covered her mouth after it the way a woman does when she wants you to know she didn't mean to. "Forgive me," Caroline said. "There's nothing to forgive, ma'am," Elizabeth said. "It's a funny thing. I'd laugh too if I were you." Thomas Caldwell stood by the sideboard with the estate ledger under his arm, and he did not laugh. He was 50 years old, and he had managed Whitmore land for 19 of those years, and he was the only person in that room watching Elizabeth's hands instead of her face. Nathaniel picked up the deed. He read it. His jaw moved once. "You signed as witness." "I signed as witness. You are my wife." "I am," Elizabeth said. "That's what makes it binding, isn't it? A stranger could witness it, and any lawyer in Richmond would pick at it for a year. But the wife signs, and there's not a man alive can say she didn't know what was happening in her own front room." The clock ticked. "You've done me a favor," Nathaniel said slowly. "I reckon I have." "Why?" Elizabeth wiped the ink off her thumb with her apron. She was 26, and she was wearing a pale blue cotton dress that had been washed so many times it had gone the color of the sky at 6 in the morning. And there was not one thing about her that morning that looked like the wife of the richest man in the county. "Because you were going to do it anyway," she said, "and I've watched men take 3 weeks to do a thing they'd already decided in 3 seconds. I got no use for the 3 weeks." Caroline stepped forward and put her hand on the back of a chair. She did it the way a person does when they want to be seen touching the furniture. "Mrs. Whitmore," Caroline said, "I want you to know I take no pleasure in this." Elizabeth looked at her a long moment. "Ma'am," she said, "I'd think less of you if you didn't." It had been decided in Richmond, in a room Elizabeth had never seen by men she had never met. That was the part nobody said out loud. Nathaniel Whitmore had married a surveyor's daughter at 29 because his father was dying and the will required a wife, and there wasn't time to court a proper one. Elizabeth Carter had been the practical answer. Her father had walked every boundary line in 3 counties. She could read a plat map at 9 years old. She could keep a ledger. She could tell you what an acre would grow before you'd broke it. And she had come to Whitmore Hall with 1 trunk and a set of her father's survey books and an understanding clear as glass that she was a contract. She had never once complained about it. That Nathaniel had told himself for 4 years was the trouble with her. She never complained. A man couldn't tell what she wanted. A man couldn't tell if she wanted anything. "You'll be provided for," he said now. "I expect so. The Hollis place, west of the creek. It's sound." Caldwell shifted his weight. "It's got a roof," Nathaniel said. "It's got most of a roof," Caldwell said. Nathaniel turned. "You've been out there. In the spring, sir. Bad ground, poor drainage. Nothing's come off it in 11 years. Caldwell said it easy, the way a man says a thing he said 100 times to himself first. Honestly, sir, it's a kindness the place is still standing. I'd have pulled the timber for the tenant barns 2 years ago if it weren't so far to haul. There, Nathaniel said. You see, it's no punishment. It's only distance. Elizabeth said nothing. Say something, Nathaniel said. You want me to say something? I would like, Nathaniel said, and his voice went hard in a way that surprised even him, for my wife to have one honest reaction in 4 years. Elizabeth put both hands flat on the table. All right, she said. The room got quiet again. I want it in writing, she said. Caldwell's head came up. In writing, Nathaniel repeated. The cottage, and the ground it sits on. Elizabeth's voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was the thing people would remember about her later when they told this story in the county, that she never once raised her voice, not that whole summer, not even at the end. You're putting your name to a paper today that gives this house away. You'll do it with a lawyer and a seal and 2 witnesses. I want the same for mine. It's a cottage. Then it costs you nothing. Nathaniel laughed a short, surprised sound. You want a deed for a rotting cabin. I want a deed for a rotting cabin, Elizabeth said. Yes. Sir, Caldwell said. What? Sir, if I may, the parcels out west are there tangled. The old lines. Some of that was surveyed before your father's time, and the descriptions are, they're what? Caldwell smiled. It didn't reach anything. Vague, sir. It'd take a month to write a clean description. There's no cause to spend a month on 90 acres of swamp. 94, Elizabeth said. Everyone looked at her. 94 acres, she said. And it's not swamp. It's low along the east side for about 9 acres in the spring, and it dries by June, and the rest of it is the best drained ground on this side of the creek, because it sits 11 feet higher than the tenant fields. Anybody who told you it don't drain has never stood on it in July. The clock ticked. My father surveyed it, Elizabeth said, in 1799, for your father. Nathaniel was looking at her now, really looking maybe for the first time since the wedding, and there was something moving behind his face he did not have a name for. 94 acres, he said. Give or take, the description'll say what it says. And you want it. I want it in writing, Elizabeth said. That's all I want. I've not asked you for one thing in 4 years, Nathaniel. I'm asking now. Put my name on the paper, Caroline Bellamy said softly. Nathaniel, darling, is it wise to— Yes, Nathaniel said. He said it fast, too fast. He said it the way a man says yes, when what he means is stop looking at me like that. Caldwell, write it up. Sir. Write it up, Nathaniel said. Today, Caldwell. Caldwell stood very still for the length of one breath. Yes, sir, he said. Elizabeth carried her own trunk down the front stairs. 2 footmen came at her and she waved them off, and they stopped in the middle of the hall and stood there with their hands empty and their faces red, because there wasn't a man in that house who'd ever been told no by the mistress of it, not once, not ever. Ma'am, one of them said, let me. You've got work. Ma'am, please. Ma'am. Elizabeth set the trunk down and looked at him. He was maybe 19. His name was Peter, and he had a mother in the village with a bad hip, and Elizabeth knew that because Elizabeth knew everything about everyone in that house, and none of them had ever once wondered how. Peter, she said, if you carry that trunk, they'll say the servants pitied her. If I carry it, they'll say she carried it herself. She picked it up again. One of those 2 stories is going to get told at every supper table in this county by Sunday. I'd like to pick which one. Peter stepped back. Then he took his hat off. He wasn't wearing a hat. He'd forgot. His hand went up to his head and found nothing and came down again, and he stood there in the hall with his empty hand at his side, and Elizabeth Whitmore looked at him for 1 second longer than she needed to. Thank you, she said. She carried the trunk out the front door. Yeah. Nathaniel watched from the window of his father's study. She's making a spectacle, Caroline said behind him. She's carrying a trunk. She's carrying a trunk slowly. Nathaniel didn't answer. Caroline came up beside him. She was 30, and she was beautiful in the specific expensive way that took 3 women and 2 hours every morning, and she had spent 6 months in Richmond making certain that everyone who mattered understood that Nathaniel Whitmore's marriage was a bookkeeping error waiting to be corrected. "You did the right thing," she said. "I know what I did. She'll be more comfortable out there. Truly. A woman like that, she was never happy in this house. You could see it. She used to stand in the ballroom like she was waiting for someone to ask her to leave." Nathaniel watched his wife walk down the drive with a trunk on her shoulder. "Nobody ever did ask her," he said. "What? Nobody ever asked her to leave? In 4 years?" He turned from the window. "She just always stood like they were about to." The Hollis place had most of a roof. Elizabeth stood in the doorway and put her trunk down and looked at the hole in the ceiling and the light coming through it and the 11 years of nothing on the floor. Behind her a voice said, "It ain't as bad as it looks." She turned. He was 60, thin as a rail, with sawdust in the creases of his knuckles that no amount of washing had ever got out. Silas Boone had built or rebuilt every barn within 9 miles of that creek, and he had not been paid on time by Whitmore Hall in 2 years. "Mr. Boone?" "Ma'am." He took his hat off. Actually took it off. "Word travels. Word travels fast." "Word travels fastest when it's ugly," Silas said. "You want the truth about the roof, or you want the polite version?" "The truth. It's bad as it looks." Elizabeth laughed. It surprised both of them. It came out of her sudden and real, and she put a hand over her mouth after, and Silas Boone stood there in the door of the worst house on the Whitmore estate and watched the mistress of it laugh at her own ruin, and something in his chest turned over. "Well," he said. "All right then." "Mr. Boone, I can't pay you." "Didn't ask. I'm telling you before you offer, so you can go home and nobody thinks less of you." She put her hands on her hips. "I've got $11 and my father's books and a trunk of dresses I've got no use for out here. That's the whole account." Silas turned his hat over in his hands. "Ma'am," he said. "Can I say a thing?" "You can say anything you like. There's nobody out here to hear it. That's just it." He looked up. "There ain't nobody out here to hear it, so I'll say it plain. 19 years I've been working Whitmore ground, and in 19 years, one person in that house ever paid me on the day they said they would." He pointed his hat at her. "One." Elizabeth said nothing. "2 winters back, my Anna took sick. Caldwell held my money 9 weeks. 9 weeks, ma'am, and every week he'd say next week, Silas, next week. And then one morning a girl come down from the hall with the whole 9 weeks in a purse and no note and no name on it." He put his hat back on. "There weren't no name on it. But there weren't but one person in that house who'd have done it and not wanted the credit. Mr. Boone." "I'll be here at first light," Silas said. "Bring my own nails." He walked off before she could say another word. Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the Hollis place for a long time. Then she went inside and opened her trunk and took out her father's survey books and set them on the floor because there wasn't a table. At the hall they had a party. It was not called a party. It was called a supper, and it was called small, and there were 41 people at it, and every single one of them had come to see whether it was true. "It's true," Caroline said, again and again, delighted, gracious, wounded on everyone's behalf. "It's quite true. And I want to say, I want it understood that no one wished her ill. No one. It was simply a marriage that never should have—" "Where'd he send her?" someone asked. "The old Hollis place," Caldwell said. Somebody whistled. "That's not a house," a planter's wife said. "My husband's father used to store hay in that." "It's got a roof," Caldwell said. "It's got most of a roof," said the planter's wife, and the whole end of the table laughed, and Caroline laughed with them, but she put her hand on her throat while she did it so everyone would understand it pained her. Nathaniel Whitmore sat at the head of his own table and did not laugh. "Nathaniel," Caroline said, "you're grim." "I'm tired." "You're grim and it's your supper." She reached over and touched his wrist. "Darling." She asked for it. She stood in that room and asked for a deed to a swamp, and you gave it to her, and now she's got exactly what she wanted. There's no cruelty in it. She wanted to go. Nathaniel looked down the table at 41 people eating his food. "She never wanted anything," he said. "What?" "In 4 years." He put his glass down. "She never asked me for one thing. Not a dress, not a horse, not a trip to Richmond. Not once." He looked up. "And the day I put her out, she asked me for one thing." The table had gone quiet without anyone deciding to. 94 acres of swamp," Nathaniel said. Nobody said anything. Then Caldwell laughed heartily, warmly, exactly on time, and said, "Well, sir, if a man's only going to ask for one thing in his life, he ought to ask better than that." And the table broke up laughing, and the moment passed, and Nathaniel Whitmore picked his glass back up. But he did not drink from it. Here, 94 acres. He turned it over that night alone in his father's study, with the deed on the desk in front of him, and the lamp guttering. The description ran 11 lines. Caldwell had written it out in that clean copperplate of his, and Nathaniel had read it twice, and it said what such things say. Beginning at a stone at the northwest corner of the tenant tract, thence south 82 degrees east. Nathaniel Whitmore could write a boundary. He could not read one. That was the thing his father had never taught him, and he had never learned, and the shame of it was small and old, and buried so deep he only touched it once or twice a year. He got up and went to the shelf and pulled down the plat book. The plat book had been redrawn in 1809 by Caldwell. Nathaniel stood there with it open in his hands and looked at the west parcels, the shaded ones, the ones marked low, poor drainage. No yield in a hand he'd known his whole adult life, and a feeling went through him that he could not name and did not like. He put the book back. He told himself he put it back because it was late. At first light, Silas Boone was on the roof. At second light, so was his nephew. By 8 o'clock there were 4 men on the Hollis place, and not one of them had asked to be paid, and Elizabeth Whitmore stood in the yard with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her father's survey book open against her forearm, and she was not looking at the roof. She was looking at the ground. "Ma'am," Silas called down, "you're going to wear a hole in that dirt. Mr. Boone, what's the highest point on this place?" "Beg pardon?" "The highest point. Where's it sit?" Silas came down the ladder. He was 60, and he came down that ladder like he was 30, and Elizabeth thought not for the first time that there was not one thing about the men who did the work of this county that the people who owned it understood. "Behind the house," he said. "Little rise. Why, show me." They walked. It took 4 minutes. Elizabeth stood on this rise and turned all the way around slow once, and then she opened her father's book and put her finger on a page and did not say anything for a long time. "Ma'am, Mr. Boone," she said, "where does the water come from?" "What water?" "The creek, the one that runs the tenant fields and the mill and the whole east side of this estate. Where does it come from?" Silas scratched his jaw. "Comes down from the hills, I reckon." "That's what everybody reckons." "That ain't the answer." Elizabeth closed the book. "The hills feed it in the spring," she said. 9-10 weeks a year. Big and fast, and everybody looks at it and says, "There's the creek, there's where it comes from." She looked at him. "And then July comes, and the hills go dry, and the creek keeps running. Why?" Silas didn't answer. "Because there's a spring," Elizabeth said, "somewhere, underground, and it doesn't care what the sky does. It runs the same in July as it does in April, and whoever's ground it comes out of—" She stopped. "Ma'am," Silas said quietly, "you saying it comes out of here?" "I'm saying my father wrote something in 1799, and nobody's read it in 17 years, Elizabeth said. And I'm saying I've stood on this rise for 6 minutes and I can hear water." They both went quiet. Under their feet, faint under 9 feet of Virginia clay, there was a sound. But she didn't dig that day. That was the thing about Elizabeth Whitmore that Caldwell had gotten wrong from the first hour, and would keep getting wrong, and would still be getting wrong at the end. He thought she'd be in a hurry. She wasn't in a hurry. She had 94 acres and $11 and a deed with a seal on it. And she had learned at 9 years old, walking boundaries with her father, that a line drawn wrong stays wrong for 100 years, and nobody notices until it's too late to fix. Her father used to say it like a prayer. "Slow, Lizzie. The ground don't move. Let it be right." So she didn't dig. She wrote it down. She wrote down what she'd heard, and where she'd stood, and what time of day it was, and she wrote down the date, and she signed it. And then she did the same thing the next day, and the day after that. And by the end of the first week, there were 14 pages in her father's book, in her own hand, and the roof was finished. Silas Boone would not take money. "I got no money," Elizabeth said. "That's why I ain't taking it," Silas said, and went home. The first trouble came on the 11th day. 2 men rode out from the hall. They were Caldwell's men, not the field hands, not the tenants. The other kind, the kind an estate manager keeps for the work that doesn't go in a ledger. And they rode into the yard at the Hollis place at 4 in the afternoon and did not get off their horses. "Mrs. Whitmore. Gentlemen, Mr. Caldwell's compliments." The bigger one had a paper. He did not hand it down. He held it. "There's a question about the timber." "What question?" "Whitmore Hall's got a standing contract for the timber on the west parcels. Been on the books 6 years. Mr. Caldwell says the deed don't touch it." Elizabeth wiped her hands on her apron. "Show me the contract," she said. "Ma'am, you've got a paper in your hand. Is that the contract?" The big man's jaw worked. "It's a notice," he said. "Then it's not a contract." "It's Mr. Yates," Elizabeth said, and the man went still because she'd used his name, and he had not told her his name. "Your mother makes the best pickled beans in this county, and she brings a jar to the hall every October, and every October, Mr. Caldwell tells her the family's grateful, and every October, those beans end up in the servants' hall because nobody upstairs eats them. I eat them. I've eaten them 4 years. She looked up at him. "Now get off that horse or ride home. I don't care which, but I'll not be handed a paper by a man sitting up above me like I'm a gate he's too lazy to open." Nobody moved. Then Yates got off the horse. He handed her the notice. She read it. It ran 3 lines, and it was signed by Thomas Caldwell, and it was not signed by Nathaniel Whitmore and Elizabeth Whitmore. Noticed that in about 1 second and a half. "There's no seal," she said. "Ma'am, there's no seal, and there's no owner's signature, and it says standing contract without naming a date or a term or a party." She folded it. "Mr. Yates, do you know what this is?" He didn't answer. "It's a man finding out he made a mistake," Elizabeth said, "and hoping I don't know it yet." She handed it back. "Tell Mr. Caldwell I've kept no copy. Tell him I don't need one." She turned toward the house. "And Mr. Yates, tell your mother I'll want 6 jars this year, and I'll pay for them, and I'll pay on the day." Yates stood in the yard holding a piece of paper. "Ma'am," he said, "I ain't the enemy." Elizabeth stopped. "No," she said. "I don't reckon you are." Myung. Caldwell burned the notice himself when it came back. He did it in the study fireplace at 11 at night in July, which is a thing a man only does if he does not want a piece of paper to exist, and he stood and watched it curl, and he thought carefully the way he thought about everything about 94 acres. He had drawn the 1809 plat. He had drawn it himself over 4 months, and he had shaded the west parcels and written low, poor drainage in his own clean hand. And the old man had signed off on it because the old man had been dying, and because Caldwell had been the only person in the room who could read it. 17 years. 17 years of the west parcels sitting there unwanted, unwalked, worthless. And every year the creek running full in July, and every year Caldwell taking his cut off a mill that ran on water, nobody could account for. and a set of tenant fields that watered themselves, and a set of books that showed the yield coming off the east, and nobody ever asking why the east yielded so well in a drought. He had built 19 years on the fact that Nathaniel Whitmore could not read a boundary. And now there was a surveyor's daughter sitting on top of the whole thing with a deed. Caldwell watched the paper burn. "It's nothing," he said out loud to the empty room. He didn't believe it. Nathaniel Whitmore rode west on the 19th day. He told himself he was riding the boundary. He told himself he was checking the tenant barns. He told himself 6 things, and he was still telling himself the 6th one when his horse came over the rise and he saw the Hollis place with a finished roof on it. There were 3 women in the yard, not servants, village women. One of them had a baby on her hip, and one of them had a basket, and one of them was arguing with his wife about the price of something. "No, ma'am," Elizabeth was saying. 2 cents. "It's worth 4. It's worth 4 in Richmond. It's worth 2 here because there's nobody here to pay 4. "Then I'll take it to Richmond." "You'll take it to Richmond and pay $1.10 to the wagon and sell it for 4 and come home with less than you'd have got from me," Elizabeth said. "Mrs. Doyle, I'm not cheating you. I'm telling you what the number is. If I told you 4, you'd like me better today and hate me in September." Mrs. Doyle stood there. 2 cents, she said. 2 cents. You're a hard woman. I'm an honest one. You'll get used to it. Nobody ever has. And Mrs. Doyle laughed, barked it out. Actually, a big ugly laugh, and Nathaniel Whitmore sat on his horse 40 yards away and watched 3 village women laugh in the yard of the worst house on his estate. He had never heard anyone laugh at Whitmore Hall. Not like that. Not once. He turned the horse around and rode home, and did not tell a soul he'd been out there. But he pulled the plat book again that night. And this time, he took it to the window and held it in the light and looked at the west parcels, and then he did a thing he had not done in 11 years. He went and found the old book, his father's book, the 1799 survey, bound in cracked green leather shoved behind the tax rolls where nobody had touched it since the old man died, and Nathaniel Whitmore pulled it out and blew the dust off it and opened it on the desk. It was in a stranger's hand, neat, small, patient, surveyed and platted by John Carter this 14th day of April, 1799. Nathaniel put his thumb on the name. Carter. He turned the pages until he found the west parcels, and he could not read the description. He still could not read the description, 11 lines of degrees and chains and stones that meant nothing to him at all. But there was a note in the margin. Small. In the same patient hand. "Spring rises here, feeds the whole East. Told Mr. W. twice. He don't want to hear it." Nathaniel Whitmore stood in his father's study at 1 in the morning with 2 books open in front of him and the shape of 19 years coming up out of the paper at him like something surfacing in dark water. He looked at the 1809 plat. Low, poor drainage, no yield. He looked at the 1799 plat. Spring rises here. The 2 maps did not agree. They did not disagree a little. They disagreed completely, and they disagreed in exactly one place, and that place was 94 acres, and he had signed it away 19 days ago to a woman he had married for a contract and never once asked a question of. Nathaniel sat down. He sat down the way a man does when his legs quit. Then he said out loud in an empty room, "She knew." She had known the whole time. She'd known in the front room with the ink on her thumb. She'd known when she took the pen. She'd known when she stood there and let Caldwell call it swamp and let Caroline laugh and let 41 people at his table decide she was a fool. "I want it in writing. 94 acres, give or take. The description'll say what it says." My father surveyed it. Nathaniel put his hands over his face. She had told him, in front of everyone. She had said it out loud, plain in her flat, quiet voice. My father surveyed it, and he had heard it, and it had meant nothing to him, because he had never once in 4 years considered that his wife might be the smartest person in any room she stood in. He had asked her for one honest reaction. She had given him one. She had asked him for the only thing on that estate worth having, and she had asked for it in front of witnesses, and he had said yes because he wanted her to stop looking at him. At 2 in the morning, Caldwell came to the study door. He came because he'd seen the light. He'd been seeing the light for 2 hours from the manager's house across the yard, and he had lain in bed and watched it, and finally he had gotten up and put his coat on over his nightshirt, and that more than anything else was the mistake. Because a man with nothing to worry about sleeps. "Sir," Caldwell said. "It's late." Nathaniel did not look up. "Caldwell." "Sir?" "Who drew the 1809 plat?" The silence went on one beat too long. "I did, sir." "From what?" "Sir." "From what?" Nathaniel said. "You didn't walk 94 acres of swamp with a chain. You copied it." "From what?" Caldwell stood in the doorway in his nightshirt and his coat. "From the existing survey, sir." "The 1799. "Yes, sir." Nathaniel turned the green book around on the desk. "Read me the margin," he said. Caldwell did not move. "Read me the margin, Caldwell." "Sir, it's 2 in the morning. Read me the margin." Caldwell came into the room. He came in slow. He looked down at the page for what could not have been more than 3 seconds, and Nathaniel Whitmore, who had known this man since he was 15 years old, watched his face do something he had never seen it do. Nothing. It did absolutely nothing. And that was how Nathaniel knew. Because a man who's surprised looks surprised. A man who's innocent squints and leans in and says, "What margin, sir?" A man who's innocent takes the book to the lamp. Thomas Caldwell looked at that page for 3 seconds, and his face did nothing at all, because he had read it before. He had read it in 1809, and then he had drawn a different map. "I don't recall the note, sir," Caldwell said. "No," Nathaniel said quietly. "I don't expect you do." The next morning, Caldwell rode west. He rode out at 6 alone, and he was in the yard of the Hollis place by 7, and Elizabeth Whitmore was already up and already working, and she did not look surprised to see him. "Mr. Caldwell." "Mrs. Whitmore." He got off his horse. He got off it fast, which she noticed. "I've come to make you an offer." "All right." $600. Elizabeth set down what she was carrying. "For what?" "For the parcel." Caldwell smiled. He had a good smile. He'd had 19 years to practice it. "It's a fair price. It's a generous price. It's more than that ground has ever been worth, and more than it'll ever be worth again, and I'm offering it because I've thought on it, and I don't like how this was done. A woman alone out here. It isn't right." $600. Cash. Today. Elizabeth Whitmore looked at Thomas Caldwell for a long, long moment. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, 19 days ago you stood in that front room and told my husband this ground was swamp. It is swamp. You told him you'd have pulled the timber off it 2 years ago, except it was too far to haul. That's right? Too far to haul, Elizabeth said. It's 1.5 miles. Caldwell's smile did not move. "And now," she said, "at 7 in the morning, you've ridden out here alone without your men, without a paper, without a seal, and offered me $600 of your own money for 1.5 miles of swamp that don't grow anything. I'm offering the estate's money." "No, you're not," Elizabeth said. "Because if you were offering the estate's money, Nathaniel would be standing here, and he ain't." The yard was very quiet. Caldwell's smile came off his face slowly, one piece at a time, like paint. "800, he said. "No. 1,000. "Mr. Caldwell." $1,200, Mrs. Whitmore, and you can walk off this ground today and go to Richmond and never look at another one of these people as long as you live." "Mr. Caldwell," Elizabeth said. "Stop." He stopped. "You've just told me what it's worth," she said. Thomas Caldwell stood in the yard of the Hollis place with his hat in his hand and his mouth open and 19 years falling out of it. "You started at 600, Elizabeth said. You went to 12 in under a minute. You didn't ask me to think it over. You didn't ask me to name a price. You went up twice without me saying one word." She picked up what she'd set down. "A man doesn't do that over swamp. A man does that when he's watched something for 17 years and he just found out somebody else can see it too. You don't know what you have." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "But you do. And you just told me." She walked toward this house. "Mrs. Whitmore?" His voice cracked. It actually cracked, and he heard it, and it was the worst sound he'd made in 19 years. "You've no idea what you've stepped into. You are a woman alone on 94 acres with $11 and no husband and no name, and every friend you think you have out here works for me?" Elizabeth stopped at the door. She turned around. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Mr. Boone put my roof on for nothing." "Boone's a fool." "Mr. Boone put my roof on for nothing," Elizabeth said, "and he brought his own nails, and when I told him I couldn't pay, he said, 'Didn't ask,' and then he went home and told nobody. That's not a man who works for you. That's a man who's been waiting 19 years for somebody to work for." She went inside. Caldwell stood in the empty yard. Behind him at the tree line, Yates sat on a horse and watched and did not say a word about it to anyone. And that night, he went home and told his mother to put up 6 extra jars. Nathaniel Whitmore did not sleep that night either. He sat with the 2 books, and he made himself learn it, line by line. Beginning at a stone at the northwest corner. He got a pencil and he drew it out on a sheet of paper wrong, and then again wrong, and then again, and somewhere around 4 in the morning on the 9th try, the shape came out right. And it was not the shape in the 1809 book. It was not close. The line had moved. Not much. A surveyor's daughter would have caught it in 9 seconds, and a rich man had needed 9 hours. But he had gotten there, and the line had moved, and it had moved in exactly one direction, and it had moved so that the spring that fed the creek, that fed the mill, that fed the whole east side of the Whitmore fortune, sat on 94 worthless acres nobody would ever look at twice. Nathaniel Whitmore put the pencil down. Downstairs, Caroline was still asleep in the biggest bedroom in the county, in a house he had signed away with a seal, and 2 witnesses, and his wife's name on the line. Nathaniel looked at the paper in front of him for a long time. Then he said quietly to nobody, "Elizabeth." And in the west, on 94 acres of ground, nobody had walked in 17 years, with a finished roof over her head, and $11 in a tin, and her father's handwriting open on the floor beside her. Elizabeth Whitmore blew out the lamp and smiled in the dark for the first time in 4 years, like a woman who had finally been asked to leave. The roof held through the first rain. Elizabeth knew it would. Silas Boone didn't put up roofs that didn't hold. But she stood inside the Hollis place that night and listened to the water hit the shingles and run off clean, and she thought about the fact that the best work on her land had been done by a man nobody paid on time, and she filed that away, the way she filed everything quiet exact in a place she could find it later. The next morning she went back to the spring. She'd been going back every morning for 8 days. She didn't bring a shovel. She brought the survey book and a stick, and she walked the same ground different ways. And she listened, and she wrote down what she heard and what the ground felt like under her feet in different places. And then she went home and copied the numbers into her own hand in the back of her father's book. On the 9th morning, Silas Boone appeared at the rise and stood there with his arms crossed. "You ain't dug yet," he said. "No." "You been walking that same patch 9 days." "Yes." He was quiet a moment. "You waiting on something?" Elizabeth looked up from the book. "I'm waiting on the rain to clear the ground. When water's been on the surface, you can't tell the surface from the spring. You need 3 dry days." She looked back down. "We had 2. Silas squinted at the sky. "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," she said. He turned to go. "Mr. Boone." He stopped. "When you built the tenant barns," Elizabeth said, "the east ones, on the far side of Whitmore Creek, who paid for the timber?" Silas turned back slowly. "Estate paid. That'd be Mr. Caldwell." "Caldwell personally, or Caldwell on behalf of the estate?" He scratched the back of his neck. "Mrs. Whitmore, in 19 years, I ain't once seen Caldwell spend $1 of his own money on this ground." "Then who told him to buy timber for barns on the east side in a year the creek didn't need them?" Silas was quiet. "He bought ahead," Elizabeth said. "2 years ago. 160 board feet for barns that weren't failing. You remember that? I built those barns." "I know you did. I was there when the bill came in. I signed off on it because Nathaniel was away, and Caldwell said it was urgent and he had a quote that had to be answered that day." She closed the book. 160 board feet doesn't get urgent in a day unless somebody's already expecting to need it soon. And nobody needs that kind of timber unless they're building something bigger than a barn. Silas turned that over. "You saying he was building on west ground?" he said. "I'm saying someone was planning to," Elizabeth said. "And then the plan stopped, all of a sudden, about 16 months ago." She tucked the book under her arm. "Round about the time Nathaniel came home from Richmond, talking about bringing me out here." They stood there in the July heat, the two of them, and the creek ran somewhere below them, and neither one spoke. "Mrs. Whitmore," Silas said slowly, "if what you're saying is right—" "I ain't saying anything," Elizabeth said. "I'm writing things down." She walked back to the house. Silas Boone watched her go, and thought about 19 years on this ground, and about the 2 years that money had been late, and about how those 2 years lined up exact with the years Nathaniel Whitmore had started coming home less, and he put it all in a row in his head, and didn't like what it added up to. He went and got a shovel. He propped it against the house without knocking. Elizabeth found it there at noon, and she did not say anything about it. On the third dry day, she dug. Not a well. Not yet. She picked the lowest point of the rise, the soft place she'd marked with a split stick 9 days back, and she put the shovel in 4 inches and hit clay, and 2 inches below the clay, the ground went dark. Wet dark. Spring dark. The kind of dark that doesn't come from rain. She set the shovel down and put her hand in the hole, and the water came up through her fingers, cold, the way creek water isn't cold in July, the way only underground water stays cold through a summer. Elizabeth sat back on her heels. She sat there for a long time with a hand covered in cold mud and the sun on her back, and the whole of 94 acres around her, and she thought about her father walking this ground in April of 1799 with his chain and his compass, and writing in a margin what he'd told the old man twice, and the old man hadn't wanted to hear. She thought about him riding home that April, and coming in the kitchen door, and washing his hands the same way she was washing hers now, with a rag and some water from the bucket, and her mother asking if it had gone well, and her father saying, "Well enough, Edith." The old man's stubborn, but the ground ain't. He'd been 51 years old in 1799. He'd died at 55. He never knew she'd end up here. Elizabeth got up, wiped her hand clean, picked up the shovel, and went back to the house to write it down. What she wrote ran 4 pages. She dated it at the top, and she described what she'd found, and where and at what depth, and what the water temperature felt like, and how far from the surface. And she drew a rough sketch of the rise, with distances marked in paces. And then she wrote a second page that wasn't description at all. It was a list. A careful, exact, quiet little list. Timber purchases and dates and amounts. Caldwell's name. Barn invoices and the estate's east side water records, as much as she could reconstruct from the 3 years she'd handled the household ledgers before Caldwell had convinced Nathaniel to lock them. She wrote down everything she'd known and said nothing about. Because that was the other thing people didn't understand about Elizabeth Whitmore. They thought she was quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she was adding it up. She had been adding it up for 4 years, and she wasn't done yet. And the day she was done, she was going to say it once clear, in front of someone who could do something about it. Not yet, but soon. She sealed the 4 pages inside the back cover of her father's book with a paste she made from flour and water, and she put the book in the bottom of her trunk, and she didn't mention it to anyone. 3 days later, Mrs. Doyle sent her daughter out with a basket and a message. The message said, "My sister's boy is sick. Fever. Doctor in town wants $2 and he don't come out this far anyway." Is there something? Elizabeth read it and went to the garden. She'd started the garden 10 days in before the roof was done, because she'd looked at the soil behind the house and seen what could be grown in it and didn't see the point in waiting. She hadn't grown herbs since she was a girl, but her mother had kept a medicinal garden, and she'd watched, and watching was the same as learning if you did it right. She came back inside with 3 things, and she ground 2 of them, and left 1 whole, and she wrapped them in a cloth, and wrote directions in pencil on a scrap of feed sack paper, and she sent the girl back with it, and told her to put the cloth in cool water first, and change it twice a day. The girl was back in 4 days. "Ma'am," she said at the door, "my cousin's better." "Good." "Ma'am, Mama wants to know what you want for it." "Nothing." The girl stood there. She was 12 or so, with a sunburned nose, and she looked at Elizabeth the way a 12-year-old looks at an adult who's said something that doesn't make sense. "She said you'd say that. She said to tell you she's bringing eggs anyway." "Tell her I'll take them." "And she said—" The girl stopped. "Say it." "She said Mrs. Hawthorne's little one's been feverish 3 days and the mama's scared and she don't know you, but she don't know what else to try." Elizabeth looked at her. "Where do the Hawthornes live?"
Yesterday.
She walked. 1.75 miles in July heat with a basket. Mrs. Hawthorne met her at the door like she was expecting an argument. She was 20-something, raw-boned and red-eyed, and she had clearly not slept in 3 days, and she stood in that doorway with her arms crossed and her chin up the way a woman stands when she's terrified and doesn't want you to know it. "I don't know you," she said. "No, ma'am." "You're from the Whitmore place." "I'm from the Hollis place," Elizabeth said. "The West Side." Mrs. Hawthorne took that in. Something shifted in her face. "The Cottage," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "The one they—" She stopped. "I heard about that." "I expect so." Mrs. Hawthorne looked at the basket. "He's 2 years old," she said. It came out of her like it had been sitting on her chest. "He's 2 years old, and he's had a fever 4 days, and the doctor—" "I know about the doctor," Elizabeth said. "Can I see him?"
Babshad.
The baby was sleeping when she went in. Hot-faced, shallow-breathed, the kind of sick that's not yet dangerous, but has been close to it, and Elizabeth put a hand to his forehead and listened to his breathing, and looked at his color and asked 5 questions, and Mrs. Hawthorne answered all of them fast, the way a woman answers, who's been waiting 3 days for someone to ask. Elizabeth made something cold. She made something else that steamed. She left instructions and sat with Mrs. Hawthorne at the kitchen table for 20 minutes while the baby slept, and the woman's hands finally stopped shaking. "How do you know all this?" Mrs. Hawthorne said. "My mother." "Was she a doctor?" "She was a woman who couldn't afford a doctor," Elizabeth said. "Same as most." Mrs. Hawthorne looked at her for a long time. Then she poured coffee out of a pot that was mostly water and pushed a cup across the table, and Elizabeth took it, and they sat there in the quiet. "I've heard things," Mrs. Hawthorne said. "About you. About what he did." "I expect so." "People talk." "They do." "They say you—" She stopped. Started again. "Some people say you signed the deed yourself." "I witnessed it," Elizabeth said. "That's not what they're saying." Mrs. Hawthorne's voice went quiet. "They're saying you stood in that room and signed it and smiled." Elizabeth wrapped her hands around the thin coffee cup. "I didn't smile," she said. "Not in there." Mrs. Hawthorne nodded. Like she'd known that. Like she'd needed to hear it anyway. "Is it true about the spring?" she said. Elizabeth looked up. "Word travels," Mrs. Hawthorne said. "Word travels a long way for 3 weeks. Word travels far when it's about water in July." The woman leaned in. "My husband works the East Fields. He's worked them 12 years. Every July he prays the creek holds, because every July it slows down, and nobody knows why it picks up again. He's asked Caldwell twice, and Caldwell says good rain's upriver, and my husband comes home and says there weren't any." She was watching Elizabeth's face. "Is it true?" Elizabeth set the cup down. "You tell your husband," she said carefully. that the East Fields are going to be fine this year and every year after it." Mrs. Hawthorne sat back. "Lord," she said softly. "You tell him quietly," Elizabeth said. "I will. I mean it. Quietly." "Mrs. Whitmore," said the woman, and her voice was something different now. "We know how to keep quiet in this county. We've been keeping quiet for Caldwell 19 years. The room went still. Elizabeth looked at her. "Have you?" she said. It wasn't a question. By the end of the third week, Elizabeth had been to 9 houses. Nobody asked her. She asked herself. She walked the roads in the morning before the heat got bad, and she knocked on doors, and she brought the basket, and she did not mention money, and nobody offered it, and after a while people stopped feeling strange about it. Word moved the way it does in a county along the creek roads, and at the mill, and over back fences, and between women who were handing eggs across garden walls, and what the word said was not that the wife had been thrown out. What the word said was that the wife was out at the Hollis place growing things that worked. That was a different story. That was a story people could hold differently. Caldwell heard it at the mill on a Thursday morning from a man who told it approvingly, and he stood there and listened to a man talk about Mrs. Whitmore's garden remedy, like it was a fine thing, and inside he was doing a calculation, the same calculation he'd been doing since the morning she'd watched him bid himself up to $1,200 in under a minute. She had 4 pages, maybe more. He didn't know what she'd written down, and he didn't know who she'd told, and that was the problem. The thing about Thomas Caldwell was that he was a careful man. He was a careful man who'd built 19 years on other men's incuriosity. And now there was a surveyor's daughter with a deed and a garden and 9 houses listening to her. And she was not incurious. He needed to know what she knew. He needed to know it before Nathaniel Whitmore started asking questions he couldn't answer. Nathaniel was already asking questions. He'd been asking them quietly alone in his study at night, which was the most dangerous kind of asking because it went in circles and came back every time to the same place. 16 days since he'd found the 2 books. He hadn't confronted Caldwell directly. He'd meant to. 3 times he'd meant to. And every time he'd walked toward it in his head and then stopped because he didn't know enough yet, because a man doesn't accuse his estate manager of 19 years of fraud and come back from it wrong, and because there was something else happening that he didn't have a name for. He was thinking about his wife, not about the spring, not about the deed, about her face in the front room with the ink on her thumb, about the way she'd said 94, give or take, about the way she'd said, "My father surveyed it in front of Caldwell," and Caldwell's face hadn't moved. Caldwell's face hadn't moved. Nathaniel had watched that happen and registered nothing in the moment, and now he kept going back to it. The way you go back to a step that felt wrong in the dark. Caroline found him at the desk on the 16th night and put her hand on his shoulder, and he went still under it. "Come to bed," she said. "In a bit." She looked at the books. "You've been at those every night for 2 weeks." "I know." "Nathaniel." Her hand tightened. "Whatever you think you've found." "I haven't found anything," he said. "I know what you think. I know what you're building up in your head." She came around the desk and sat on the edge of it and looked at him directly. "She's a plain-spoken woman with a grudge and a bit of her father's knowledge. That's all. She always wanted to be taken seriously, and she never was, and now she's found a way to make you feel like you missed something. That's what she's doing." "How do you know what she's doing?" "Because I know women," Caroline said. "And I know what it looks like when a woman decides to make herself interesting." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "She asked for 94 acres of swamp," he said. "Yes." "She said it like she was asking for a glass of water." "Because she was not upset," Nathaniel said. "She was not angry. She didn't fight, and she didn't cry, and she didn't plead. She just stood there and waited for me to give her what she'd already decided she was taking." He turned back to the desk. "And I gave it to her. And then I stood at that window and watched her carry her own trunk down a drive she'd walked 1,000 times, and she did not look back, not once. And I thought at the time she was too proud. But that wasn't it." "Nathaniel, she wasn't proud," he said. She wasn't showing me anything. She was finished. He said it the way a man says a thing he's only understood too late, and it sat in the room between them and didn't go anywhere. Caroline got off the desk. She signed it, she said. She walked out that door. Whatever she is, she left. She didn't leave, Nathaniel said. She went to the west side of my own land, and she has not left for one day. Caroline left the room. Nathaniel sat with the books.
Was alone.
On the 25th day, Yates came to him. He didn't come to the house. He didn't send a note. He came to the eastern fence line at 6 in the morning, where Nathaniel rode most days alone, and he was already there waiting, and Nathaniel pulled up and looked at him. Yates. Mr. Whitmore. He had his hat in his hands. I got something to say. Say it. I work for you, Yates said. Not for Caldwell. I want that said first. Nathaniel said nothing. I've worked this estate 14 years, Yates said, and I have done things on this estate I don't feel right about. And I'm not going to put them in order right now, because some of them I did myself, and I'd like to get clear of this conversation before you decide what to do about that. His jaw was tight. But I'm going to tell you 2 things, and then I'm going to go do my work, and you can do with it what you want. Go ahead. Yates turned his hat over. Caldwell rode out to the Hollis place the morning after you found those books. I went with him. He offered your wife $1,200 for the parcel. The morning light lay flat and hot across the fence line, and a mockingbird somewhere in the tree line was going through its whole catalog, and Nathaniel Whitmore sat on his horse and did not move. 1,200, he said. He started at 6. She didn't say a word. He went to 12 in under a minute. Nathaniel looked at the fence. What did she say? She told him he'd just told her what it was worth. Yates put his hat back on. And then she went inside. Nathaniel sat with that. The second thing, Yates said. The East Mill, the water accounts. There's a second set. Nathaniel's head came up. Caldwell keeps one ledger, you see, Yates said. There's another one. It's in the manager's house in the floor under the press. I know because I helped him move the press when he put the thing in 8 years ago, and I didn't ask about it then, and I'm asking about it now by telling you where it is. Yates turned his horse. My mother's making pickled beans, he said. 6 jars this year. She's keeping one back. He rode off. Nathaniel sat at the fence line alone, and the mockingbird finished one song and started another, and he thought about a woman who didn't look back, and about a man who'd known where a ledger was buried for 8 years, and about the difference between a person who keeps quiet because they have nothing to say and a person who keeps quiet because they're counting. He went to the manager's house that afternoon. He waited until Caldwell rode out to the South Barns, and then he went in through the front door with a key he'd had since the house was built. And he went to the back room and he looked at the press. It was heavy. He moved it anyway. It took him 6 minutes, and he scraped his hand on the edge and bled on the floor, and he did not stop. The board underneath came up with a knife. The ledger was there. It was thinner than the official one and older, and the cover had been replaced twice that he could see, but the pages went back. He flipped to the front. The pages went back 14 years, in Caldwell's hand, in columns that Nathaniel could not fully read, but could read well enough. He could read the numbers. He could read them well enough to know they didn't match. He sat on the floor of Caldwell's back room in the July afternoon heat with a stolen ledger in his hands and a bleeding knuckle and the shape of 14 years of quiet theft laid out across his lap. And he thought about his father, who'd been dying while Caldwell drew his maps, and his father who'd trusted the man, and his father who'd said on his deathbed, Thomas is solid, Nathaniel. Solid as this ground. And Nathaniel had believed him because his father had believed everything about the ground that the ground hadn't said itself. He put the ledger back. He put the board back. He put the press back. He mopped up the blood. He went home and washed his hand and stood at the window and looked west. You couldn't see the Hollis place from the hall. Too many trees. But he stood there and looked west like he could see through them, and he thought about a woman who had known, who had looked at Caldwell's face in 1799. No, Not in 1799, in her father's kitchen, in the survey books, in years of watching the ledgers before Caldwell found a reason to take them away. Who had looked at the shape of things and seen what it was? Who had said nothing? Who had waited? Who had stood in the front room and taken the pen and signed her own name as witness, and asked for 94 acres, and walked out the front door and never looked back, because she had already decided. She knew, Nathaniel said again. Same words, same room, different feeling. The first time he'd said it, he'd meant she knew about the spring. Now, he meant something bigger. He meant she knew everything. She knew, and she waited, and she chose her moment, and she chose her ground. 94 acres, give or take, and she went to it, and she was building something on it, and whatever she was building, he had helped her build it. He had given her the deed. He had said yes because she had looked at him, and now he stood at the window looking west, and he could not decide whether he was furious or ashamed, and somewhere under both of those was a third feeling he had even less of a name for. Caldwell came to him that evening. He came smoothly easy-voiced, the way he always came, with a piece of paper and a question about the fall accounts, and Nathaniel sat at the desk and answered it, and they talked for 20 minutes about grain prices and fence repairs and the tenant contracts, and not once did Caldwell's voice change, or his hands move wrong, or his eyes go anywhere they shouldn't. 19 years. Nathaniel thought 19 years of this. 19 years of this voice in this chair and this face across this desk, and I never once wondered what was under it. The West parcels, Nathaniel said as Caldwell was folding his paper. Caldwell went still for half a breath, just half. Sir, the Hollis ground, the deed I signed. Nathaniel leaned back. You think she'll manage out there? The half-breath was gone. Caldwell's face smoothed back to easy. Honestly, sir, I doubt it. The ground's poor, and she's alone, and come winter she'll be asking to come back. Best to let her come to it herself. Probably right, Nathaniel said. Give it till October, Caldwell said. She'll have had enough. Maybe so, Nathaniel said. Caldwell gathered his things. Sir, he said at the door. I want to say I know this hasn't been easy. It's a hard thing, a marriage that doesn't take. But you made the right call. The estate needs stability, and Mrs. Whitmore is well. She's not exactly built for this life. What life is that? The kind you lead, sir. Easy, warm. 19 years warm. The kind that needs a woman who knows what a drawing room's for. Nathaniel nodded. He did not say anything else. Caldwell left. Nathaniel sat at the desk and breathed once slow, and then he opened the top drawer and took out the sheet of paper. He'd drawn the boundary lines on 9 tries. The 9th one right, and he looked at the shape of 94 acres, and he thought about a man who'd been stealing from his family for 19 years, and was still standing in his doorway, telling him what kind of woman he needed. He folded the paper. He put it in his coat. 2 days later, 28th day. Since the deed, a new woman came to the Hollis place. She came alone on foot, which was how Elizabeth knew she hadn't been sent. She was perhaps 45, and her name was Mrs. Ruth Garland, and she was the housekeeper at the largest farm between Whitmore Land and the county seat, and she stood at the door and said without preamble, I've heard about the spring. Word gets around, Elizabeth said. I'm not here about the spring. Mrs. Garland looked at her straight. I'm here because 3 other women told me to come. Because they've been talking and they've been thinking, and there's something we think you should know. Elizabeth opened the door wider. Come in, she said. Mrs. Garland came in, and she sat down on the bench by the table, and she looked at the books and the papers and the dried herbs and the tin with the $11 in it, and she looked at all of it the way a woman looks at evidence. How much do you know about Thomas Caldwell? She said. Before your husband. Elizabeth sat across from her. Tell me what you know, Elizabeth said. I'll tell you what matches. Mrs. Garland nodded. She put her hands flat on the table. All right, she said. This started before your husband inherited. And for the next 2 hours, Elizabeth Whitmore sat and listened and wrote things down. She wrote down dates and names and amounts and patterns, things these women had seen and held and never spoken because there was no one to speak them to. Things that individually looked like mistakes or coincidences, or the normal rough edges of estate life things that together, in a column in order, in ink, looked like something else entirely. She filled 6 pages. When Mrs. Garland left, Elizabeth sat with the 6 pages on the table and the last light coming through the window and the spring running somewhere below her feet, steady and cold and permanent. And she thought about what her father used to say when he'd walked a boundary wrong and had to start again. Start at the fixed point, Lizzie. Everything fixed is a gift. Start there and work out. She picked up her pen. She wrote the date at the top of the first page. She had her fixed point. The letter came on a Tuesday. Elizabeth knew it was from Nathaniel before she opened it because nobody else in this county sealed their correspondence with gray wax. She'd noticed that about him in the first month of their marriage, that he used gray because his father had used gray, and he'd never once questioned it, the way a man doesn't question the things he learned before he was old enough to know he was learning them. She broke the seal at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. It said, "I am coming to conduct an audit of the Western parcels. Wednesday next. You will have access to any records you hold. N. Whitmore." She read it twice. Then she set it face down on the table and finished her coffee. Silas came by at noon with his nephew to look at a drainage problem on the east edge of the property, and he found her in the garden with her sleeves up and her hands in the dirt, and he said, "You got company coming." And she said, "Wednesday," and he said, "You need anything?" And she said, "I need that drainage problem fixed before Wednesday." And he said, "Done." And that was the end of that conversation. Mrs. Doyle sent eggs that afternoon. Mrs. Hawthorne sent bread. Yates's mother sent 6 jars of pickled beans with a note that said, "Keeping one back like you said." M. Boone. Elizabeth lined the jars up on the shelf and stood there looking at them for a moment, and then she went back to the table and opened her father's book to the pages she'd sealed in with flour paste, and she worked the edge up clean with a knife, and she took out what was inside. 14 pages now. 6. From Mrs. Garland's visit. 4 from the original account. 4 more from the 2 weeks since. Every name, every date, every number she could reconstruct from 4 years of watching ledgers she was never meant to understand. She spread them on the table and read them through once the way her father used to read a completed survey looking for the thing that was almost right. The almost that was worse than the wrong because it was harder to see. She found 3 places where she'd been imprecise. She rewrote those 3 pages from scratch and burned the old ones in the fireplace. Then she sorted everything into order, dated at the top of each page, and tied it with the piece of blue ribbon she'd taken off her best dress 2 months ago, because there was no occasion for best dresses anymore, and she needed the ribbon. She set the tied packet on the table. She picked up Nathaniel's letter. She turned it over. On the back in the margin, in her small neat hand, she wrote, "Audit confirmed. Records will be available. E. Whitmore." She sealed it with plain wax. She had no seal, and set it by the door for the morning. Then she went to bed and she slept, which was something she hadn't done cleanly in 6 weeks. Nathaniel told Caldwell about the audit on Monday. He did not tell him he was going to do it. He told him he was doing it already and that the records for the Western parcels going back to 1805 would be needed by Wednesday, and Caldwell stood in the study doorway and something moved behind his face fast there and gone. "Of course, sir," Caldwell said. "I'll have everything prepared. I'll want the water accounts specifically." "The water accounts," Caldwell said. "The creek records. All of them." "Sir, the creek records for the western side are there thin. There's not much out there to account for. A few drainage notes, some flood records from 2012. He paused. 2012, sir. Very old. Probably not useful. "Bring them anyway." Caldwell's jaw moved once. "Yes, sir." "And Caldwell." "Sir." "The 1809 plat," Nathaniel said. "I'd like the original field notes, the ones you drew from." The room went very still. "The field notes," Caldwell said. "The notes from the survey itself, when you walked the boundary, The working papers. Nathaniel looked at him with the expression of a man asking about the weather. Every surveyor keeps field notes. My wife's father kept field notes. I'd imagine your source had some. I'll look, Caldwell said. He was already calculating. Nathaniel could see it without being able to name it, the way you can see wind in grass without seeing the wind. Caldwell was calculating which lie was the cheapest one to tell. Wednesday, Nathaniel said. Wednesday. Caldwell confirmed. He left. Nathaniel turned to the window and looked west and thought, she knew. He kept coming back to that. Not as an accusation now, as something else, as the beginning of a question he'd never thought to ask. What else does she know? Oh, Caroline found out about the audit that night. She found out because she read Caldwell's expression at dinner and asked him afterward in the hall out of Nathaniel's hearing, and Caldwell told her just enough to make her understand, and not enough to make her dangerous, which was how he handled everyone. She came to Nathaniel's study at 10. An audit, she said. Yes. Of her parcel. Of the Western accounts generally. Nathaniel. She sat down across from him. She was very composed. That was the thing about Caroline Bellamy. She was always composed, and it had always read to him as strength. And now for the first time sitting across from her with 2 books open on the desk, it read as something he didn't have a word for yet. What is it you think you're going to find? I don't know. But you think you'll find something. I think there are questions the records should answer and haven't. Questions she put in your head, Caroline said. She went out to that cottage, and she started talking to people, and she's been working this county for 2 months, Nathaniel. You know what she's doing. She's building a case. She's been building a case since the day she walked out of this house. What kind of case? He said. Against you. She said it flat and direct, which he'd always admired about her. She's humiliated. She's a proud woman, and she was put out of her own house, and she's spending every bit of that pride trying to find a way to make you look wrong. And if I am wrong, silence. If I'm wrong, Nathaniel said, then I'd like to know it myself before I find out some other way. You're not wrong, Caroline said. The estate is fine. Caldwell has managed this land for 19 years without a breath of trouble. Caldwell, Nathaniel said carefully, offered my wife $1,200 for 90 acres. He told me was swamp. The word dropped between them and sat there. When? Caroline said. The morning after I found the survey books. He looked at her. He didn't tell you that. She didn't answer. He told me just enough to make you worried, and not enough to make you ask the wrong questions, Nathaniel said. Is that about right? Caroline stood up. I'm going to bed, she said. Caroline. She stopped at the door. Did you know, he said, about the accounts, about any of it, before? She stood with her back to him for a long moment. I knew what Caldwell told me, she said, which is apparently not the same thing. She walked out. Nathaniel sat at the desk alone and thought about how many people in his life had been telling him exactly what they chose to tell him, and how long it had been that way, and how he had taken the shape of their telling for the shape of the truth. He was still sitting there at 2 a.m. when he heard a horse come into the yard fast. It was Yates. He came to the back door, not the front, which meant it was bad, and Nathaniel got there before the housekeeper woke, and Yates stood on the step with his hat in his hand and his horse still blowing behind him. What happened? Nathaniel said. The manager's house, Yates said. The back room, the press. Nathaniel went very still. Someone moved it, Yates said. I was coming past an hour ago, and there was a lamp in the back window. When I came around, the press was 2 feet from the wall and the board was up. Was Caldwell there? His horse was there, Yates said. He rode out 20 minutes later. I followed him to the crossroads. He went north. North was Richmond. Nathaniel stood in the doorway. Was anything taken? He said. I don't know, sir. I didn't go in after. Yates paused. But I know what was there. You know? Nathaniel said slowly. Because you told me where it was. Yes, sir. And you told me, Nathaniel said, which means you knew what it was. Yes, sir. The night was hot and full of crickets, and far off a dog was barking at something, and Nathaniel Whitmore stood in the door of his house and understood that two of the people closest to him had been running separate calculations for longer than he knew. How long? He said. 14 years, sir. The ledger. How long did you know? Yates looked at his hat. I've known what I could see, he said. I didn't know all of it, but I knew enough that I should have said something and didn't. Why didn't you? Because I had a mother with a bad hip, Yates said, and Caldwell was the man who decided whether I kept my work. He looked up. I'm not proud of it, Mr. Whitmore, but I'm telling you now. Nathaniel looked at him for a long time. Go home, he said. Sir. Go home, Yates. Come back at first light. There's nothing to be done in the dark. Yates put his hat on and got back on his horse, and Nathaniel stood at the door and listened to him right away. And then he went inside and sat at the desk, and he did not sleep. And the question that turned over and over in his head through the whole long hot night was not about Caldwell. It was about Wednesday. Wednesday was 2 days away, and he had told Elizabeth the audit was Wednesday. And if Caldwell had just taken the hidden ledger north, then Wednesday was either going to be a disaster or it was going to be nothing, depending entirely on one thing. On what Elizabeth Whitmore had written in 14 pages, tied with a blue ribbon. Wednesday came up hot. Elizabeth was at the table at 6 with the pages in front of her and coffee she'd made herself, and a candle. Not because she needed it, but because she was in the habit of working by candlelight, and old habits were one of the few things in her life right now that cost nothing. She heard horses at 7:30, not one horse. 3. She heard them on the road, and she heard them turn in at the gate, and she heard them stop outside, and then she heard a knock at the door that was Nathaniel's knock firm. Not hard, 2 knocks, only the knock of a man who's been raised to announce himself and not to perform it. She opened the door. He looked tired. That was the first thing. He looked like a man who'd been awake for most of 48 hours, and he'd come in riding clothes, not estate clothes, which meant he'd dressed in the dark or close to it, and he'd brought 2 men she didn't know, which meant he'd thought about who to trust and come up short close to home. Elizabeth, he said. Nathaniel. She stepped back. Come in. He came in. The 2 men waited outside. He looked at the table, at the candle, at the coffee, at the pages tied with the blue ribbon, and he stood there, and his jaw moved once, and then stopped. You knew I was coming, he said. You wrote me a letter. You knew before the letter. Elizabeth looked at him. Yes. How long have you known, he said, about the accounts, about Caldwell, about the spring and the plat and the whole, how long, Elizabeth? She sat down. She poured a second cup of coffee and pushed it across the table. He sat down across from her, which was not something she'd expected, and she understood then that he hadn't come as the estate owner. He'd come as a man who needed to sit down. The spring, she said. I knew from my father's books. He wrote it in the margin in 1799, and he told me about it when I was 9 years old, and I'd had it filed away for 17 years. She wrapped her hands around her cup. The accounts I started to see after our first harvest. Small things. Numbers that didn't add when I added them. I asked Caldwell twice, and he explained both times in a way that sounded right and wasn't. She paused. He's very good at that. Yes, Nathaniel said. The plat I knew was wrong the first week I was here. I walked this ground for 9 days, and it doesn't match what he drew. She looked at him. A surveyor's daughter knows what the ground says. Nathaniel put both hands flat on the table. They were good hands. She'd noticed that in the first month of their marriage too, that his hands were the hands of a man who worked even when he had enough money not to, and she'd put that down as something. Caldwell went to Richmond Monday night, Nathaniel said. Elizabeth nodded once. He took something with him, Nathaniel said. A ledger. The real accounts. 14 years. I know. He looked up. Yates told me, she said. Not directly. He sent his mother with the 6 jars, and she stayed for a cup of tea, and she talks when she's nervous. Elizabeth met his eyes. I've known since Tuesday morning. And you? He stopped. You didn't send word. No. Why not? Elizabeth set her cup down. Because, she said, I've spent 4 years sending word and being told I was adding wrong. The room was very quiet. Nathaniel looked at the table between them. I know, he said. I'm not saying it to wound you, Elizabeth said. I'm saying it so you understand why I kept my own records. Can I see them? She picked up the ribbon-tied pages and set them in front of him. He looked at them. He didn't touch them. There are 14 pages, she said. The first 4 are the spring location depth flow estimates cross-referenced to my father's 1799 notation. The next 6 are account discrepancies. Specific dates, specific amounts, 2 of them cross-referenced to mill revenue records that I kept copies of before Caldwell moved the ledgers. She put her finger on the ribbon. The last 4 are testimony. Whose? 8 women, Elizabeth said. From 8 different households on or adjacent to Whitmore land. Names, dates, specific events. 2 of them go back before your father died. Nathaniel's hands tightened on the table edge. Before my father, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She'd learned in 4 years that Nathaniel Whitmore went silent when he was working through something real, and she'd also learned that nobody around him let him be silent long enough to finish. So she sat across the table from him and drank her coffee and didn't say a word. Finally, he said, he told my father the spring wasn't there. Yes, my father asked him to look. He looked. He came back and said poor ground, bad drainage, no value. Nathaniel's voice was even. It was the evenness of a man holding himself very carefully. And my father believed him. Because Thomas Caldwell had been on this land 23 years by then, and my father trusted what had survived that long. Yes, Elizabeth said. And so the plat got redrawn, he said. In 1809, after my father was dying, and before I knew what I was looking at, Caldwell moved the Springs parcel out of the main estate description, Elizabeth said. It's subtle. You'd have to hold both maps side by side and know what you were reading. Most men couldn't do it. She paused. My father could have done it in 10 minutes. But your father was dead. My father was dead. Nathaniel picked up the tied pages. He untied the ribbon carefully, like the thing was worth treating with care, and he opened to the first page and read. He read for a long time. Elizabeth got up and refilled her coffee and stood by the window and looked out at the rise where the spring was, and she thought about 9 years old walking a boundary line with a man who smelled like cedar shavings and showed her how to read the ground like it was a letter. Somebody wrote you. The ground tells the truth, Lizzie. People don't always, but the ground always tells the truth if you know how to ask it. These women, Nathaniel said behind her, they'd testify. She turned. If asked properly, by someone with the authority to ask. A county hearing. Or a magistrate, yes. And the spring you can show it. I can take anyone who wants to see it and put their hand in the ground, Elizabeth said. It runs cold in July. Anybody who knows water knows what that means. Nathaniel set the pages down. He looked at her across the room with an expression she'd never seen on him in 4 years and didn't have a name for, and she held his gaze the way she held everything still level, waiting to see what it was before she decided what to do about it. Elizabeth, he said. I went to his floor in the dark and moved a press and found 14 years of fraud, and I still don't know half of what you've got in those pages. No, she said. You don't. How is that possible? Because you weren't looking, she said simply. And I was. He stood up. He crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped 6 feet from her, and she didn't move back, and they stood in the small kitchen of the worst house on the Whitmore estate in the July heat, with 14 pages between them and 4 years behind them, and whatever came next in front of them. I need to ask you something, he said. Ask it. Why didn't you use this to come home? Elizabeth tilted her head a fraction. I mean, he said you had all of this. The spring, the discrepancies, the testimony. You had it before I ever wrote you that letter. You could have sent for me. You could have sent this to a lawyer in Richmond and made it impossible for anyone to—" He stopped. "Why didn't you—" Elizabeth looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Because coming home wasn't the point," she said. He waited. "I didn't come out here to win an argument," she said. "I came out here because you gave me 94 acres of ground that nobody wanted, and I put my name on it and it's mine. And whatever I find on it, whatever I build on it, that's mine too. That doesn't depend on whether I'm welcome in your front room." Her voice was even and clear and not unkind. "You didn't give me a punishment, Nathaniel. You gave me a deed." He stood very still. "What I'm giving you," she said, "is the truth about what's been done on your land, because it's your land and you have a right to it. Not because I need you to know it. Not because I need anything from it." She picked the pages up off the table and held them out to him. "Take them. Do what you need to do." He took them. He held them and looked at her. "Caldwell's in Richmond," he said. "I know. He's going to talk. He's going to find a lawyer and he's going to get ahead of this and try to make it complicated." "He's been making it complicated for 19 years, Elizabeth said. "He's good at it." "Not as good as he thinks," Nathaniel said. Elizabeth looked at him. "I want to call a county hearing," he said. "I want to put this in front of the magistrate. I want the spring documented by a surveyor, a real one, not someone Caldwell's picked, and I want those 8 women heard." He paused. "Will you let me do that?" "It's your estate," Elizabeth said. "It's your evidence," he said. The word sat between them. "Yes," she said. "You can use it." Caldwell came back from Richmond on Thursday. He came back because he'd gone up there and found that the lawyer he'd counted on had not been where Caldwell had put him, which was to say that 3 years ago, this particular lawyer had done some business with a Whitmore cousin that had gone badly, and the Whitmore name and a request for help were not a combination that made him cooperative. Caldwell came back, and he came back without the ledger, which he'd left in Richmond in a strongbox at the tavern where he stayed, which he believed was safe and which was not safe, because the man who owned the tavern was an old friend of Yates's father. And 3 words passed between Yates and that man on Wednesday afternoon, before Nathaniel's letter had reached Richmond. None of this Caldwell knew. What he knew was that he needed to be back on Whitmore land before anyone noticed he'd gone, and he needed to know what Wednesday's audit had produced, and he needed to get in front of it. He rode to the hall at noon and went to Nathaniel's study and knocked. "Come," Nathaniel said. Caldwell came in. The study was the same as it always was. Desk, lamp. The 2 plat books, the 1799 and the 1809, open side by side on the desk, which was not the same as it always was. Caldwell stopped. "Sir," he said, "you're back." "I never left," Nathaniel said. "Sit down, Caldwell." Caldwell sat. He looked at the 2 books, and he was very calm. He was remarkably professionally calm in the way of a man who has rehearsed this moment. Not this specific moment, but the shape of it, the shape of being found out, which he'd been rehearsing since 1809, because careful men rehearse their worst days. "I see you've been comparing the surveys," he said. "I have. Sir, I want to be transparent with you." "Then be transparent," Nathaniel said. Caldwell put his hands on his knees. The 1809 plat was drawn in good faith. The 1799 description was old and imprecise, and I was asked by your father to produce something cleaner. If there are discrepancies, they're the product of different methods, not of any intention to— "Caldwell," Nathaniel said. He stopped. "You offered my wife $1,200 for 90 acres of swamp." Caldwell was silent. "Starting at 6, Nathaniel said. "Going to 12 in under a minute." He leaned forward. "A man doesn't bid that fast on swamp." "I was trying to provide for Mrs. Whitmore in a difficult—" "With whose money?" Nathaniel said. The room went very quiet. "I beg your pardon, sir." $1,200, Nathaniel said. "You said it was the estate's money. I've gone through the household accounts for the last 3 months. There's no withdrawal of that size authorized." No notation. No request. He set a single page on the desk and slid it across. So, whose 1200 was it, Caldwell? Caldwell looked at the page. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he can't talk his way around. I anticipated authorization, he said. You anticipated it, Nathaniel said. Yes, sir. You went to my wife on land I deeded to her with $1,200 of money you anticipated I would eventually authorize to buy back a parcel you'd described to me as worthless. Nathaniel's voice was utterly level. Does that sound right to you? Caldwell sat with his hands on his knees and the 1799 survey open 3 feet from him, and the margin note, Spring Rises Here, fed the whole East, told Mr. W twice. He don't want to hear it sitting there in dead man's handwriting like a signal fire that had been burning for 17 years. I'd like to speak to a lawyer, Caldwell said. I imagine you would, Nathaniel said. You can do that. I'm not stopping you. He stood up. But before you do, there are 8 women in this county who've agreed to speak to the magistrate. There are water records cross-referenced to mill revenue going back 9 years. And there is a spring on 94 acres that any trained surveyor will confirm has been feeding this estate's creek since before my father owned this land. He came around the desk. I'm calling a county hearing, Monday. You can speak to whoever you like between now and then. Caldwell stood. He stood, and he looked at Nathaniel Whitmore, and he did the calculation one last time fast. The way he'd always done his calculations, and what came back was not a number. What came back was an image. Elizabeth Whitmore at the front table with a pen in her hand, and the way she'd set it down after, and the way she'd looked at Caldwell when she handed the notice back. You've just told me what it's worth. He'd thought she meant the land. She hadn't meant the land at all. She built this, Caldwell said, not accusing, almost impressed. The whole time she was out there gardening and delivering remedies and sitting in those women's kitchens, she was building this. Yes, Nathaniel said. She knew from the beginning. She knew from before the beginning, Nathaniel said. She knew when she was 9 years old. Caldwell picked up his hat. She's a remarkable woman, he said. She is, Nathaniel said. And she never needed me to see that. He rode to the Hollis place that afternoon. He came alone. 1 horse. No men, no papers. No agenda beyond the thing he'd been turning over since Wednesday morning when he'd sat at her table, and she'd said, You didn't give me a punishment. You gave me a deed. The yard was busy when he came in. Silas Boone and 2 other men were working on the drainage at the east edge. Mrs. Doyle's daughter was going out the door with an empty basket. Somewhere behind the house, a woman was singing low and unself-conscious, the kind of singing a person does when they think they're alone. It stopped when he came through the gate. Elizabeth came around the side of the house with her hands muddy to the wrist, and a smear of something across her forehead, and she looked at him the way she looked at everything level, assessing, not afraid. Nathaniel, she said. Elizabeth. He got off the horse. He did it slowly, and he tied the horse himself, and then he turned and stood in the yard of the Hollis place with his hat in his hand. The yard was not the yard he'd passed 3 months ago. The yard 3 months ago had been weeds and broken fence, and the ghost of 11 years of nothing. Now it was something. He couldn't have said what exactly it was. Still simple, still plain, still a far cry from anything that would impress anyone in a Richmond parlor. But it was ordered, and it was alive, and the people working in it were working the way people work when they've chosen to. Not when they've been told to. Silas Boone had put his hammer down and was watching from the fence line. I called the hearing, Nathaniel said. I heard. Monday. Yes. He turned the hat over in his hands. I need to ask you to be there. I'll be there, she said. They'll ask you questions. I know. Caldwell will have someone there. Someone who knows how to make simple things complicated. I know how to make complicated things simple, Elizabeth said. That's the other direction. It should be sufficient. He almost smiled. He caught it just before it came out the way a man catches something that surprises him, and she saw it, and she didn't react to it, but she catalogued it in the same place she catalogued everything else. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. "The mill revenue," he said. "The water accounts. The east fields." He stopped. "The creek that runs all of it, it comes from your ground." "Yes." "That means—" He stopped again. "Elizabeth, legally the water rights are mine," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "I know," she said quietly. "I know what I have." "You always knew." "I always knew," she agreed. He stood in her yard with his hat in his hands, and the afternoon burning down, and Silas Boone watching from the fence line, and the whole shape of the last 4 months sitting between them like a plat map he'd only just learned to read. "Why didn't you use that?" he said. "The water. You could have at any point, you could have made a claim and shut everything down and forced—" "Because I didn't want to force anything," Elizabeth said. "I wanted it to be true because the ground says it's true, not because I put somebody's back against a wall." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not Caldwell." The words landed. He stood there and let them land. "No," he said quietly. "You're not." "Monday," Elizabeth said. "Monday," he said. He put his hat back on. He got back on his horse. He turned toward the gate, and then he stopped, and he sat there a moment with his back to her and his eyes on the road. "Elizabeth," he said. "Yes." "I'm sorry," he said. "For the trunk, for the front room, for 4 years of not looking at what was right in front of me." He didn't turn around. Some things are easier said to the road. "I know that doesn't fix what was done." The yard was very quiet. "No," Elizabeth said. "It doesn't." He nodded once. He rode out. She stood in the yard and watched him go, and Silas came off the fence and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You gonna be all right Monday?" Silas said. "I'm going to be fine Monday," Elizabeth said. "Because if you need somebody to—" "I have 14 pages and 8 women and a spring running cold in July," Elizabeth said. "I'll be fine." She went back inside. She sat down at the table and opened her father's book. She turned to the last page he'd written in. "Spring rises here," it said. "Told Mr. W. twice. He don't want to hear it." Below it, in her own hand, added 8 weeks ago, on the morning after she'd put her fingers in the cold ground. "He hears it now. Papa, he hears it now." The Monday hearing started at 9. Elizabeth was there at 8:30. She came alone, which people noticed. She came in the same pale blue dress she'd worn the day she signed the deed, which people also noticed. And she sat in the second row with her father's book on her lap, and her 14 pages folded inside the front cover, and she did not look at anyone when she came in. The room filled up fast. Faster than a county hearing normally filled, which meant word had moved the way word does when it carries the weight of something people have been waiting to hear, said out loud. Silas Boone was there. Mrs. Doyle was there. Mrs. Garland. Mrs. Hawthorne. 6 other women who had sat in their own kitchens, with their own knowledge and their own silence, and decided that Monday was the day to put it down. Yates came in at 5 to 9 and sat in the back. Nathaniel came in at 9 exactly. He sat at the front table to the magistrate's left, and he did not look at Caroline's seat, which was empty, and he did not look at Elizabeth when he came in. But Elizabeth saw his hands when he set his papers on the table, and she saw they were steady, which told her what she needed to know. Caldwell's lawyer came in at 2 minutes past 9. He was a Richmond man, well-dressed, the kind of well-dressed that was meant to make a county magistrate feel provincial, and he looked around the room with the expression of someone who had done this in smaller rooms than he was used to, and expected to be done by noon. The magistrate called order. His name was James Whitfield, and he was 61 years old, and he had been magistrate of this county for 22 years. And he had known John Carter, Elizabeth's father, since they were boys, and he had not mentioned that to anyone, and he would not mention it, because it was not a fact that needed mentioning. The facts that needed mentioning were the ones on the table in front of him. This hearing is called on the matter of Whitmore estate water rights and account irregularities for the period 1802 through 1816, Whitfield said. Mr. Whitmore, you've called this hearing. Begin. Nathaniel stood. He was not a man who gave speeches. He'd never pretended to be. But he laid it out plainly, in order the way Elizabeth had laid it out in 14 pages, the two surveys, the discrepancy in the boundary line, the spring, the plat redrawn in 1809, the year his father was dying, the year Caldwell had been the only person in the room who could read a map. He was 6 minutes in when Caldwell's lawyer stood. "Objection to characterization, sir," the lawyer said to Whitfield. "The 1809 survey was conducted in good faith based on—" "Sit down," Whitfield said. "Sir, my client has a right to—" "Your client will have his turn," Whitfield said. "Sit down, Mr. Fenton." Fenton sat. He sat with the expression of a man recalculating. Nathaniel finished. He sat. Whitfield looked at the room. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Elizabeth stood. She did not bring the pages. She knew what was on them. She'd written them. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping, and the room was so quiet through all 11 of those minutes that you could hear the clerk's pen scratching. And when she said, "Spring rises here," quoting her father's margin note from memory, the woman directly behind her made a small sound and covered her mouth. "You can confirm the spring's location," Whitfield said. "I can take anyone who wants to see it and show them cold water coming out of Virginia clay in the middle of July," Elizabeth said. "I've done it once. I'll do it again." "The account discrepancies," Whitfield said. She gave him the first 6 pages and walked him through them point by point. Date amount corresponding mill revenue discrepancy. Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. But it was precise in the way of a woman who learned precision before she learned anything else, and Whitfield followed it without asking her to repeat herself once. When she sat down, Caldwell's lawyer stood again. "If I may, sir," Fenton said. He was recalibrating, trying to find the shape of the thing now that he'd heard her. "The records Mrs. Whitmore cites are her personal reconstructions. She has no access to the official estate ledgers and therefore no—" "Why doesn't she have access?" Whitfield said. Fenton paused. "Sir?" "She was the wife of the estate owner for 4 years, Whitfield said. "Why doesn't she have access to the official ledgers?" The pause was half a beat too long. "Mr. Caldwell managed the accounts," Fenton said. "Yes," Whitfield said. "That's what I understand." He let that sit. Then he said, "Call your first witness, Mrs. Whitmore." Mrs. Garland went first. She sat in the chair at the front of the room, and she looked at nobody in particular, and she told what she knew. The way a woman tells what she's known for 19 years in a kitchen, she wasn't sure anyone would ever ask about careful measured, not performing just true. "The water fees," Whitfield said. "You're saying those were charged twice. Charged to the estate and charged separately to the tenant accounts," Mrs. Garland said. "I saw it 3 times. 2 of those times I asked Mr. Caldwell about it, and he said it was a bookkeeping correction and it would clear." "Did it clear?" "No, sir." "How do you know?" "Because my employer's husband does the tenant accounts himself," she said. "And he showed me the numbers and they didn't clear. The double charge stayed both years." Fenton stood. "Sir, this is hearsay." "It's testimony," Whitfield said. "Sit down." Mrs. Hawthorne went second. Then 2 women Elizabeth had visited, one whose husband worked the East Mill, one whose family had farmed adjacent land for 30 years. Then Yates. Yates was the one Fenton tried hardest on. "You've worked for Whitmore Hall 14 years, Fenton said. "Yes, sir." "And in those 14 years, you saw Mr. Caldwell conduct his duties." "I did." "And you never once in 14 years raised a concern?" Yates looked at him. "No, sir." "So why now?" The room waited. Yates looked at his hat in his hands. "Because 14 years ago I had a mother who needed me to keep my work," he said. "And now I've got a woman who walked out of the biggest house in this county with 1 trunk and went and put her hand in the cold ground and told me what was under it." He looked up. "And if she can do that, I reckon I can sit in this chair." The room was very still. Fenton sat down. Ned. Then Caldwell himself stood. He stood without being called, which made Whitfield look up, and Fenton reached for his arm, and Caldwell didn't let him. "Sir," Caldwell said to Whitfield, "may I speak?" Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. "You may." Caldwell turned. He didn't look at Nathaniel. He didn't look at the 8 women. He looked at Elizabeth. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I want you to know that I have spent 19 years believing I was managing this estate for its own good. I told myself that every year, that the men who owned it didn't understand it the way I did, that the money I took was no different from wages I wasn't paid, that nobody was hurt." He paused. "I was wrong." Elizabeth looked at him. "I was wrong," he said again, "and I knew about the spring. I knew from the day I drew that map, and I knew your father wrote that note, and I knew what it meant, and I drew the line somewhere else anyway." Something moved through his face. "He was a good man, your father, honest as the ground he walked." The room did not make a sound. "I'd like to make a full account to this court," Caldwell said. "Everything. The dates, the amounts, the 2 sets of books, the timber purchased, the water fees." He looked at Whitfield. "All of it." Fenton was on his feet. "Mr. Caldwell, I strongly advise—" "You're dismissed, Mr. Fenton," Caldwell said. He said it quietly. He said it the way a man says a thing to himself that he's decided before he walked into the room. Fenton stopped. "I'm the client," Caldwell said. "I'm dismissing you. Thank you for coming." Fenton stood there a moment, caught between professional instinct and the look on Caldwell's face, and then he gathered his papers and walked out, and the door swung shut behind him. The room exhaled. Whitfield looked at Caldwell. "You understand what a full account means?" "Yes, sir." "You understand the consequences?" "Yes, sir." Caldwell looked old suddenly. Old and very tired, like a man who'd been holding something too heavy for a long time and had finally set it down. "I'm 60 years old, sir. I don't reckon I've got time left to keep carrying it." Whitfield nodded once. "Clerk," he said, "take the record." It went on until 3 in the afternoon. Caldwell talked for 2 hours. He talked in the same clean, organized way he'd done everything. Dates, amounts, methods. The exact mechanism by which he'd shifted the boundary line and kept 2 sets of accounts and paid himself from a mill that ran on water he'd hidden on a map. He did not editorialize. He did not excuse. He said what happened and when and where the money was. When it was done, Whitfield called a recess. Elizabeth went outside. She stood in the July heat with her father's book against her chest, and she breathed once slow, the way she'd been breathing all morning, steady, even not letting anything show, and then she let it out. Silas appeared at her shoulder. "You all right, ma'am?" he said. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I'm fine, Mr. Boone." He handed her his water flask without a word. She took it and drank and handed it back. "Your father would have liked to see that," he said. She didn't answer. "I knew him a little," Silas said, "before he died. He came out to walk that west boundary one more time, spring of 2003. I was working the Hollis place back then before it went empty. We talked some." He turned his hat in his hands. "He told me about a daughter who could read a plat map at 9 years old. Said she'd inherited his eye for the ground." Elizabeth looked at him. "Said he hoped it served her better than it served him," Silas said. She looked away. "It did?" she said quietly. "I reckon it did." Nathaniel came out 2 minutes later. He came out alone, and he stopped when he saw her, and then he kept coming, and Silas Boone moved off without being asked, because Silas Boone was a man who understood when to go. They stood in the July heat in front of the county courthouse, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "It'll be settled by Friday," Nathaniel said. "Whitfield will issue the water rights determination today, I think. The fraud case goes to the state, but Caldwell's cooperation means—" "Nathaniel," Elizabeth said. He stopped. "I'm not asking about the case," she said. "The case is fine. The case is going exactly where it should go." She looked at him. "I'm asking about you." He was quiet. "This wasn't your fault," she said. "What Caldwell did. You inherited a man your father trusted, and you trusted him too. And that's not stupidity, and it's not weakness. It's what happens when somebody decides to be the only person in the room who understands the books." Nathaniel looked at her. "I should have seen it," he said. "Maybe," Elizabeth said. "Or maybe you should have had a wife who told you what she saw instead of writing it down in a book and waiting." Something crossed his face. "Why didn't you?" he said. "Tell me, in those 4 years, why did you never once just say it?" Elizabeth looked at the road. "Because you never once asked," she said. "Not accusing, just true the way the ground is true, the way water is cold in July. Not what I thought, not what I saw, not what I knew. You had Caldwell for the accounts and Caroline for the evenings, and that was the shape of the thing, and I fit in the middle of it somewhere, and nobody ever looked at the middle." He absorbed that. "I'm asking now," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. The door behind them opened, and Whitfield's clerk came out with a paper, and the morning settled into the afternoon, and the first part of it was done. Whitfield issued the water rights determination at 4 o'clock. He read it in 3 sentences. "The spring on the parcel deeded to Elizabeth Whitmore, wife of Nathaniel Whitmore, on the 14th day of July, 1816, was confirmed by surveyor's evidence witness testimony, and the 1799 plat of John Carter as originating on said parcel. All water rights associated with said spring were the property of Elizabeth Whitmore by deed and by law. Any estate revenues deriving from said water source were subject to renegotiation." The room was very quiet. Then Mrs. Doyle in the 3rd row said, "Well, it's about time." And the room broke, and people laughed, and Whitfield banged his gavel once and didn't try too hard to stop it. Nathaniel was looking at Elizabeth. She was not laughing. She was sitting with the book in her lap and her hands folded over it, and her face very calm the way it was always calm, and she was looking at the window. And whatever she was thinking it alone. He thought 4 years, and I never once knew what she was thinking. He thought I'm not sure I deserve to know. He thought I'd like to, though. I'd like to spend as long as it takes. He didn't say any of that. He said, "Elizabeth." She looked at him. "Come home," he said. The room had gone quiet again, the way it does when a word lands in a public place that was meant for only one person. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. "I am home," she said. "I've been home for 3 months." He understood. He understood it completely and immediately, and it was not what he'd hoped, and it was exactly what he deserved, and he sat with it the way she sat with everything still level, without flinching. "Then let me come to you," he said. She looked at the window again. She looked at it for a long time. "Maybe," she said finally. Quiet, not a door closed. Not a door open either, not all the way. "Ask me again, after you've shown me what you mean by it." He nodded once. He understood that too. Outside, Silas Boone was already loading his tools back onto the wagon because a man who put a roof up when it was needed knew to start building again when the next thing needed building, and he didn't wait to be asked. The hearing was over. The part that came next was harder and slower and more real than anything that had happened in a courthouse, and every person in that room understood it, and not one of them said so out loud. Some things you just have to go and do. He came the next morning, not to ask again. He'd said he would show her, and a man who shows up the day after and asks again has not understood what he was told. He came with his coat off and his sleeves already rolled, and he knocked once at the gate post. Not the door, the gate post, because it was her gate, and he waited. Silas was already there. Silas was always already there. Silas looked at Nathaniel over the fence and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You any good with a post hole?" Nathaniel looked at the east fence line where 3 posts had gone soft at the base and needed pulling. He looked at Silas. He took his hat off and set it on the fence rail. "Show me where," he said. Silas handed him a bar. They worked for 2 hours without talking, and Elizabeth came out at 9 with coffee and looked at her husband in the dirt, pulling fence posts, and did not say anything, and set the coffee on the rail and went back inside. But she'd come out. That was the thing Nathaniel held on to through 2 hours of post holes in July heat. She'd come out. She'd seen him, and she'd made a decision to bring coffee, and she'd brought it. That was a thing a woman does when she's deciding. Not deciding. And he understood the difference now in a way he hadn't understood anything in 4 years of marriage. At noon, Silas packed his tools. "Same time Thursday," he said to Elizabeth. "Thursday," she said. He went. And for the first time since July of 1816, Nathaniel Whitmore and Elizabeth Whitmore were alone on 94 acres without a deed being signed, or a hearing being called, or a fraud being uncovered. The quiet was enormous. "Sit down," Elizabeth said. He sat. At the kitchen table, same chair as before, and she put food in front of him that she'd made herself, and he ate it, and it was the best meal he'd had in 4 months, which he thought might have something to do with the cooking, and something to do with the company, and something to do with the fact that a man eats differently when he hasn't earned the right to be at the table and knows it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right. I went through the full accounts last week," he said. "Everything Caldwell put before the state. The water revenue alone, what the mill has taken in over the creek over your spring over the last 14 years, Elizabeth, it's considerable." "I know the numbers," she said. "I mean, it's yours," he said. "Legally. Whitfield's determination makes it yours. I'm not going to argue it, and I'm not going to make you fight for it." She looked at him across the table. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you could buy 3 more properties like this one," he said, "with what's owed. You don't need me for anything financial. I want you to know that I know that." The room was very quiet. "Why does that matter?" she said. "Because I want you to know that if I'm asking to be here," he said, "it's not because you need me to be, it's because I want to be." He put his hands flat on the table. "There's a difference. I know it took me too long to understand it, but I understand it now." Elizabeth looked at her coffee. "Nathaniel," she said, "that's the most honest thing you've said to me in 4 years." "I know. That's a sad fact." "I know that too." She looked up. Something in her face shifted just slightly, not softening, not quite, but moving. The way ground moves in spring when the frost finally breaks. Slow, real, from the inside out. "Come back Thursday," she said. "Silas'll have more posts." He took that for what it was. He came back Thursday. Caroline left on a Friday 3 weeks after the hearing. She left without a scene, which was the most graceful thing she'd ever done. And Elizabeth respected it more than she would have respected anything else. She sent word through the housekeeper not to Elizabeth directly, but Elizabeth heard it that she was returning to Richmond, that she wished the family well, and that she hoped in time everyone would remember that she had tried in her way to do right by the situation as she understood it. Elizabeth thought about that for a day. Then she wrote Caroline a note. It said, "You were given a story by a man who needed one. That's not the same as being wrong. I hope Richmond is good to you. E.W." She didn't know if Caroline received it well, or received it at all. It didn't change why she'd sent it. Nathaniel came every Tuesday and Thursday, then Mondays too. He did not stay. He worked whatever needed working: fence drainage, the new well housing that Silas had started on the rise above the spring, and he ate whatever Elizabeth put in front of him, and he talked about what needed talking about, and he went home. Every time he left, he knocked the gatepost once on the way out, the same knock, and Elizabeth heard it from wherever she was in the house, and she did not always come to the door, but she always heard it. One Tuesday, he brought the old Platt book. The 1799. Green leather, cracked spine. He set it on the table and said, "I want you to teach me how to read it." Elizabeth looked at it. "It'll take more than an afternoon," she said. "I've got time," he said. She taught him. Not that afternoon it did take more than one. She taught him over 4 Tuesday mornings, sitting at the kitchen table, with the book open between them and a pencil and a sheet of paper. And she showed him what the degrees meant and what the chains meant, and how to walk a description from a fixed point, and how to find a fixed point when the stone had moved or the tree had died and nothing was where the paper said it was. He was a slow learner in the way that careful people are slow, not because he didn't understand, but because he wanted to understand completely before he moved on. She found she didn't mind it. She found she liked it. The 4th Tuesday, he worked through a description himself, start to finish without help, and he came out right. And he looked up from the paper, and she said, "That's it." And he sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who has just understood something he should have understood a long time ago, and is choosing not to be bitter about the delay. "Your father taught you this," he said. "Starting at 9, she said. "He was a good teacher. He was a patient one," she said. "He used to say the ground doesn't rush, so neither should you." Nathaniel looked at the paper in front of him with its careful lines. "I've been rushing my whole life," he said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "Rushing past things." "Yes." He looked up. "Past you." She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. The word sat between them clean and simple. And it was not an accusation anymore. It was just the truth. The way a boundary line is the truth, it tells you where you were, and it tells you where you are, and it tells you that the two are not the same place. He reached across the table. He didn't take her hand. He set his hand down next to hers close, and she looked at it, and she looked at him, and she turned her hand over. She put her palm against his. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. The coffee went cold, and neither of them reached for it. October came. The harvest off the 94 acres was the best yield in the county that year, which people talked about because it shouldn't have been. It was new ground first-year cultivation on soil that Caldwell had been calling poor for 11 years. And yet there it was. The drainage that Silas had corrected the soil, that Elizabeth had read right from the first week, the water that came steady from underground in the dry months when every other field on the estate was praying for rain. The east tenants noticed, the mill manager noticed, the county assessor noticed, and sent a letter, and Elizabeth wrote back in her own hand, with numbers the assessor had to read twice. Word moved the way it always moved in this county, fast, and with opinions attached, and what the word said now was different from what it had said in July. In July, it had said the wife was put out. In October, it said the wife built something. And between those two tellings, something had shifted in the county's understanding of Elizabeth Whitmore that no deed and no hearing could have produced. The ground had done it. The ground and the time and the work and the spring that ran cold in July and kept running. Nathaniel heard it at the mill. He heard it at the county seat. He heard it from a man who shook his hand and said, "Your wife's got a better eye for land than any man I know." And he said, "Yes, she does." And he meant it completely. He told her that evening. He'd started staying past dark sometimes, and she'd stopped sending him away, and they'd sit at the table and talk the way people talk when they've stopped performing for each other and are just saying what they think. He said that, Elizabeth said. He meant it as a compliment. "It is a compliment," she said. "The best kind one a man doesn't know he's giving, because he forgot to put it through a drawing room first." Nathaniel smiled. He'd been smiling more. It was still a careful smile. The smile of a man who'd been serious so long, he'd forgotten how to do it casually, but it was real, and Elizabeth had catalogued it in the place she catalogued things that mattered. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "I wrote to a lawyer in Richmond about the deed," he said. "The one on this parcel." Her face didn't move. "I want to expand it," he said. "The description. The water rights determination adds the spring, but the boundary lines what Caldwell moved, those should be restored. The original 1799 lines." He set a paper on the table. "Which means the parcel as your father surveyed it is closer to 140 acres. Elizabeth looked at the paper. "You're giving me more land," she said. "I'm giving you back what was always yours," he said, "by your father's survey, by the truth of the ground." He looked at her. There's a difference. She picked the paper up. She read it through once, careful the way she read everything. Then she read it again. Then she set it down. There's a clause here, she said. Yes. In my name only, she said. Yes. Regardless of the status of the marriage, she said. That's what this says. That's what it says, he confirmed. She looked at him across the table. Nathaniel, she said. What are you doing? Making sure, he said, that you never have to choose between the land and anything else. That nothing I do or don't do can touch what's yours. His voice was even, but his jaw was tight, the way a man's jaw goes when he's saying something that cost him something to arrive at. I put you in that position once. I had all the power, and I used it without thinking, and I sent you somewhere that was meant to be nothing, and it turned out to be everything. I won't do that again. The lamp between them was burning low. Sign it, he said. And then I want to ask you something else. She looked at him. She picked up the pen. She signed. He took the paper when she was done, and he folded it and set it in her hands. Not in his coat pocket, not on the table in her hands, and he said, Keep that. She held it. Ask your question, she said. He stood up. He went around the table and he stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and he was not performing anything. Not doing the thing a man does when he's rehearsed it. He was just standing there, plain in the kitchen of the worst house on the Whitmore estate in October, with muddy boots from the afternoon's work, and sawdust on his sleeve from helping Silas on the well housing. He said, Will you let me stay? Not come home. He'd tried that once, and he'd understood why it missed. Not come back, and not forgive me, and not any of the versions of those words that were about him. Will you let me stay? Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. She thought about July and the deed and the ink on her thumb. She thought about a trunk carried down a long drive without looking back. She thought about cold water in clay, and her father's handwriting in a margin, and 8 women at a kitchen table finally saying what they knew. She thought about post holes in July heat and 4 Tuesday mornings at a kitchen table learning how to read the ground. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Not appreciated, not praised, not useful, seen. He was looking at her the way a man looks when he's stopped telling himself a story about someone and is finally just looking at who they are. She stood up. She was almost as tall as him had always been, and she stood in front of him and put the deed on the table behind her, and she looked at him straight. You'll have to learn to ask before you decide things, she said. Yes. You'll have to mean it when you say you're listening. Yes. And if you ever, she said, send me somewhere again thinking it'll break me. It'll build something, he said quietly. I know. She looked at him. Then she reached up and put her hand on the side of his face, the way a woman touches a man when she's deciding whether to trust the face in front of her, and she felt him go still under her hand, completely still, the way he'd gone, still in the front room the day she'd taken the pen. Except this time it was not surprise. This time it was something else entirely. Stay, she said, one word, clear, final, hers. He put his hand over hers and held it there, and neither of them moved for a moment. And outside the spring ran on in the dark, cold and steady, the way it had run since before either of them was born. The way it would run long after, indifferent to deeds and hearings and the slow, difficult work of 2 people learning to be honest with each other. It ran because it was a fixed point. Some things are fixed. Some things don't move, no matter who draws the map wrong. Hi. The county recorded the amended deed on a Thursday. The description ran 14 lines now, the original 1799 language restored. Exact. John Carter's survey brought forward 17 years into a world that had finally stopped arguing with it. Elizabeth Whitmore, wife of Nathaniel Whitmore, held 143 acres in fee, simple, including the spring, including the water rights, including the high ground and the first-year harvest that had already become the thing people pointed to when they wanted to explain what good land management looked like. Silas Boone was at the courthouse when the clerk filed it. Nobody had asked him to be. He was there because he'd been walking past, and the clerk had seen him and told him, and he'd gone in and read the filing copy over the clerk's shoulder, and stood there quietly for a moment. The clerk said, "Something wrong, Mr. Boone?" "No," Silas said. "Something right." He put his hat on. Finally. He walked out. At the Hollis place, nobody called it the Hollis place anymore, hadn't for a month though. Nobody had agreed on what to call it. Instead, Nathaniel was on the roof. He'd taken to it the way he'd taken to the post holes and the well housing and everything else he'd come to do on those Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Badly at first, then better, then competent in the specific way a man gets competent when he stops being embarrassed about learning. Silas had stopped hovering over him 2 weeks ago and started just handing him nails, which was the highest compliment Silas gave. Elizabeth came out and looked up. "Deeds filed," she called. He looked down. "How do you know Mrs. Doyle's daughter came by?" she said. "Word travels." "Word travels fast when it's good news," he said. "Word travels fastest when it's ugly," she said. "But it doesn't do too badly with good." He came down the ladder. He stood in the yard with sawdust in his hair and the October light behind him. And she looked at him, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that did not need a word, and that was new too. The wordless thing. The thing that happens when two people have been honest enough with each other long enough that they can be quiet without it costing anything. She handed him the water flask. He drank. He handed it back. "What do you want to do with the south corner?" he said. "Silas thinks we could run a second drainage channel if we—" "Show me," she said. They walked the boundary together, the two of them, in the October afternoon, and she pointed things out, and he watched where she pointed, and when he asked questions, she answered them without shortening the answer for him, and when she asked questions, he took his time. They stood at the south corner with the light going long and the creek audible below them, steady in October, as it had been in July, and Elizabeth put her hand out flat, feeling the air off the water. "My father stood right here," she said. "In 1799. He would have stood right about here." "How do you know?" "Because this is where the description starts." She looked at him. "The fixed point. Everything in the survey begins right here." Nathaniel looked at the ground. "Start here and work out," he said. She looked at him. "You said he used to tell you that," he said. "Start at the fixed point." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "That's what we're doing, isn't it?" It was not quite a question. She looked at the creek and the October light and the 143 acres that her father had walked and she had walked, and that now held the record of everything, the spring and the fraud and the posts and the roof and 8 women at a table and 1 man learning to read a map because it was past time. "Yes," she said. "That's what we're doing." She took his hand. Not the way she'd taken it at the table, tentative turning, still deciding. She took it the way a woman takes a fixed point. Certain, clear, choosing. And that was how Nathaniel Whitmore came to understand what his wife had known since she was 9 years old, standing on a boundary line with her father in the April cold, that the most important thing on any piece of ground is not the house, not the money, not the name on the deed. It is the person willing to read the truth of what's under their feet and build from there. Elizabeth Whitmore had been reading it all along. She had started at the fixed point, and she had worked out and she had built something real on ground that everyone else had called nothing. And when the man who had underestimated her finally stopped rushing and stood still long enough to see it, she chose to let him stand beside her. Not because she needed him to, because she wanted to. And that on 94 acres that became 143 on a spring that ran cold in July, and every month after on ground her father surveyed and she reclaimed, and they would both tend from that day forward, that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.